Welcome to the 10th edition of the Georgetown International Arbitration Month. It is a real pleasure to be with you today, presenting this great event. The theme for today's day is Careers in Arbitration. I am Martin Weinstein, one of the organizers of the Arbitration Month. And in this first panel of the day, we are going to be talking about networking in arbitration, which, as we all know as students, it's a very important part of our careers. And in order to address this issue, we're going to have excellent panelists who have extensive experience working in this area of law. Our panelists today will certainly help us to understand how to build our career and how to manage networking in arbitration. Today we have first Ariana Cheng. Ariana works as an associate in Evershed, Sutherland. She previously worked for the United States Court for the Eastern District of Virginia. And Ariana currently advises clients on business litigation and dispute resolution matters, including international arbitration, cross-border disputes, securities enforcement, and commercial litigation. Thank you very much for being today. Harsh Sanketi is an associate in Wiley and has represented clients in international arbitrations and litigation proceedings. Prior to joining the firm, he worked in international arbitration practices of leading law firms, and he has been appointed by the Republic of India to his panel of arbitrators to resolve domain and name disputes. He also worked at the World Bank in 2015. Prior to that, he did his Master's of Arts degree in Cambridge University, and he holds an LLM from Georgetown University Law Center. Katie Gonzalez currently works as an associate in Cleary Gottlieb, and she has experience representing international and domestic clients in international arbitration matters, as well as in litigation proceedings. She holds a JD from Harvard Law School and has a bachelor degree on arts degree from Dartmouth College with a magna cum laude distinctions. She currently specializes in international arbitration, litigation, and sovereign governments and international institutions. We thank our panelists for joining us on this Friday, and we really look forward to hearing you speak on the topic. We also thank Rebecca Bunyan, the communications coordinator of the CIS, who is moderating this panel. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you everyone for coming. We look forward to this discussion. I just wanted to say we'll start with brief introductions from everyone. We've had the bios, but perhaps a general overview of networking and kind of just overarching thoughts from each of our panelists. Our first question is, what, according to you, is the best way for students to approach and meet practitioners in the field? So we'll have short introductions one by one, and then kind of general thoughts on networking, and then we'll move on to specific questions, and then at the end we'll have questions from everyone. So if you want to note those down, we have 15 minutes of questions from the audience, and you can keep those noted as we go. So starting with Ariana, if there's anything else you wanted to add and general overviews of networking, we'd love to hear those.
Great. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's good to see some familiar faces from the International Commercial Arbitration with a Foreign Sovereign class that I co-teach with Will O'Brien, a partner at Eversheds. So I'm a fairly new and junior associate. I'm in my second year. So I'm a 2020 JD graduate of William & Mary Law School. And during that time, I've always been interested in international law. So I worked with a lot of LLMs. I was a teaching assistant for our LLM legal research and writing program. And for my 1L summer, I spent my 1L summer internship in Lithuania. And so I was working for a small think tank called the Vilnius Institute for Advanced Studies, doing some work on corruption and criminology. But through I feel like a lot of my advice on networking is it's part luck, and then you take advantage of those opportunities that come from that luck. And so I was interning with another William & Mary Law student, And her mother was an attorney who had a contact at Evershed's office in Lithuania because they have an office in Vilnius. And so we got in contact. And so we ended up meeting the managing partner in their Lithuanian office. And at that point, it's a pretty small office. They're very tight knit. And so Jonas, he was like, oh, well, how about, because, in Europe, the summers tend to be a little bit slower, even for lawyers and attorneys. And so they were like, well, we have capacity, so you can come and job shadow with us. And so I ended up doing my official internship through William & Mary Law School, but also I was job shadowing at Evershed's office in Lithuania. And through that, obviously, there was a lot of networking opportunities, and that kind of sparked the idea in my head. Obviously, I had my 2L summer internship, which in the US, that tends to be your more, you're getting closer to graduation, and it tends to be when you find a summer associate position, which is more official and it's more in the practice area that you want to be in. And so because of that connection, I decided to apply to Evershed's summer associate program in DC, among other programs. But I think that was one of the reasons why I ended up taking the offer from Evershed's, because of that prior connection with our international offices, as opposed to some of the other offers I got. And I'm trying to think of what else I want to generally introduce. Oh, so I think it's really interesting because I know one of the things that I think is important to talk about is how to network during COVID, during the pandemic, and how hard it can be to network with people over Zoom or phone calls. And I just wanted to make a note that I've been there because I was in Lithuania during my 1L summer, and that tends to be when you're starting to apply for 2L summer jobs, because the the on-campus interview process happens almost a year before. And so all the networking that I did was, over Zoom, and usually with a significant time difference, because I was talking to a lot of US practitioners. And so I was very proactive about not putting pressure on people, but just sending an email and being like, can we have a conversation? I'll accommodate the time difference. And so I had a lot of calls late at night in Lithuania to try to match up with people's work schedules. And I think as long as you don't put any pressure and say, like, this is just a conversation, I find that tends to open up better conversations, because the person doesn't feel like you're asking them for a job. It's more just like, I want to learn about your practice. And then that tends to lead to things, because even if they're not offering you a job, they may give you insight on their firm. And those are the things that you want to know when you're going into an interview, as opposed to just being like, can you pass my resume along or pass my CV along to someone else? Because especially for me, I would love to do that, but sometimes I'm not quite at that level in my career where I have that much sway or power. So.
Thank you. That's great. I think we'll note the kind of informal ways of networking as well as the more formal ones as we go. So now moving on to Harsh.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be back. It's been almost like 5 years, maybe, since I've been back here. I think I graduated in 2015. Gosh, 7 years. But I'm proud Hoya. And I'm glad to be here. I think I did an event like this a couple of years ago as well. So honestly, I'm terrible at networking. And that's why I thought that would be fun to speak at this panel, because it would force me to think about things that I should do better and things that I've done better accidentally that have worked out. And it seemed to me that the first thing is to stop thinking of it as networking. For all those of you who want to build careers in international arbitration or careers in any field, getting to know practitioners and getting to know other people in the field is indispensable, even when you don't have a goal in mind. It's really the informal exchange of information, of perspectives, of sort of philosophies, that, to use quite a grand word, is really important, whatever stage of your career. And, when you're a senior practitioner, you can learn a lot more from junior practitioners who are sometimes clued into the gossip network or clued into the work culture of various firms or organizations. And of course, when you talk to more senior practitioners, there's literally, a wealth of knowledge they can put at your disposal if they so want to. How to do it is challenging. And maybe I can tell you what worked for me when I was here at Georgetown as an LLM student. The first thing I did was I took an incredible number of classes on international arbitration. I tried to take every class the university offered in international arbitration. I was told I couldn't do that. So I ended up auditing some of those classes. And actually, one of the classes I audited was Anne-Marie Whitesell, Professor Whitesell, whom many of you will know. And it ended up being a very smart decision to take a class without credit, just turning up for 4 or 6 hours a week, because it gave her a chance to get to know me, and it gave me a chance to get to know her. So when I started applying for jobs, she was able to say truthfully, Harsh has taken my class. He has a perfect attendance record. I think I was the only person that year who did. And he's really passionate about international arbitration, and, you should meet him and see where it goes. And she put in a good word for me when I was applying for my first job at the World Bank. And that carried a lot of weight. So the first good news is that by being at Georgetown and by doing a course in international law, international arbitration, you're already doing all of the right things. And you're already going to meet a lot of practitioners who are useful to stay in touch with, and who can be useful mentors. The second piece of advice I would give is to engage in and pay attention to the debates that are constantly going on in international arbitration. Because it is a field that is still more or less in, if not infancy, it's in its adolescence. And so we don't really know still how it will turn out, whether there's a right way to do it. It's much more indeterminate than, working in, for example, commercial litigation in the US, right? There's much more scope to rethink what are the basic assumptions that underlie international arbitration. And one of the people I encourage people to think about in this field is Jan Paulsen, who was hugely influential, but became influential largely by coming up with provocative ideas and presenting them to other practitioners and being like, hey, why don't we do this? And lots of people thought he was crazy, and lots of people thought he was dangerous. But it got him well known. And in the world we live in today, being notorious is half as good as being, universally respected. So engage with the debates that are going on. Read GAR, read the other publications. Try and find a little corner of this field that you can make your own. And you can be, if not expert, then relatively well informed about. The third thing I would say, and this is sort of picking up what Ariana said, is that, in some ways networking or building relationships is kind of like dating. You don't want, a first date shouldn't be about, just jumping on the other person. It should be, it's a delicate dance. One of the ways in which you can succeed is being well informed by finding, if you're going to talk to a partner at X firm, take the time to read some of the things they've written. Take the time to come up with a proposal and say, hey, I see you were really interested in, the topic of security for costs in international arbitration, and you wrote an article about it 10 years ago. Do you know there's this recent decision from the ICC? And that gives you a chance to demonstrate that you worked hard, diligence is valuable, that you're passionate about the field, that's valuable as well. And it gives you an intro to sort of start thinking about ways in which you guys can collaborate and do something together. Because that makes it, if they know you, they can vouch for you. If you work together, they care more about you than about some random person who's just sent their resume by email. And so I would recommend to all of you that when you're thinking about networking, think about, building a reciprocal relationship between you and the person you're talking to, because those are the kinds of relationships that are ultimately durable. But we'll get into some of this in more detail. I think I've talked enough for now.
Thank you very much, Harsh. And now, Katie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Gonzalez, and I think as mentioned, I'm a fifth-year associate in the International Arbitration Practice Group at Cleary. And I think maybe my perspective today will be a little less traditional in the sense of, unlike Harsh, who attended every class here at Georgetown, I took no classes in international arbitration in law school. And when I started at Cleary, I came in with a very open perspective as to kind of what type of law I wanted to practice. And since then, I've been able to kind of carve out a niche in the international arbitration space. And I think one of the ways I've been able to do that, particularly without having, maybe the more academic background, is to really sort of become involved in the international arbitration community, and particularly that in New York through involvement in a lot of different organizations and trying to contribute to those organizations, not just through scholarship or speaking on panels, but also by, helping others sort of grow their careers and also, plan their own events and contribute in that sense. So I think for me, one of the, I think the most helpful things, and hopefully we'll be able to impart today through this conversation, is the importance of authenticity in arbitration as well, and the authenticity that you can bring to sort of networking experiences. So my practice and my experience and sort of the interest I think that I brought to my work at Cleary largely stemmed from work in Latin America. And that's been a lot of my focus as an associate, working primarily in commercial arbitrations in Latin America. And so when I join organizations or approach individuals to speak with and to network with, it really comes from that perspective of my regional focus, my language focus, my interest in this commercial work. And I think, when starting out in your career, there's oftentimes a desire to kind of, do everything and to really, spread out and try to do it all, which is good and can be helpful. But I think to the extent that you can also be a little bit selective in the type of work that you want to do, it can really help you build a name for yourself and a brand for yourself. And, when you're really focusing on those issues or topics that are of interest to you, you're going to be a lot more engaged and a lot more comfortable in that setting. And I think that will come across and, lead to those more fulfilling relationships with the people that you meet in that field. So with that, I'm looking forward to this conversation and to answering some questions.
Thank you very much. I think on that note, kind of thinking about a holistic approach to arbitration, we'll move on to our question about soft skills. So, Ariana, what kind of soft skills that are not necessarily related to the legal profession and that you think are useful for building a career would you note?
So I think that just generally being, and I think this goes for outside of international arbitration, but I think a lot of times when people think about networking or, getting connections in any field, especially just being an attorney, I think people find that they have to hide parts of themselves and, maybe not be their most authentic self. And I don't know, maybe just not to just judge me by my appearance, but I'm very much someone who, I think it's important to be an individual and stay true to yourself. I'm very openly part of the LGBTQ community at my firm. And I've always, from the beginning of my career, I've always made it a point to not feel like I have to hide parts of myself or be inauthentic. And I think that has kind of shaped the way that I approach things like soft skills. And I think that it makes me better able to connect to people that I wouldn't necessarily be able to if I always was so worried about being a traditional attorney or the way that attorneys have always looked or always acted. And so I think that's not a super clear answer, but I think that that can get you further than you think. In terms of things like moot court, I think moot is great. I personally was not part of that kind of thing when I was in law school, mainly because I didn't really know about international arbitration until after all of our tryouts and things were over, because a lot of that happened during your 1L year. And I knew I wanted to do something international, but I didn't know even what international arbitration was. I didn't come from a background of attorneys. And so it really was just me figuring things out kind of one step at a time. And I guess that would be another tip I have. Like, don't feel like you have to have things planned 5 years out. You kind of just have to take advantage of each opportunity as it opens up along the way. But of course, if you already know that that's what you want to do, I would say that can only help to be able to do things like this moot and other types of things that can just build those skills, oral advocacy skills. Even though I didn't do something like mock trial or moot court, I did Model UN when I was in college. I was on the debate team for many years. And so all those things, I think, even if they don't have a direct line, can be beneficial. So, and of course, the typical things like intercultural communications, language skills, those are all great things to have.
Yeah, I think that's probably quite reassuring for our students that everyone can find their own path and kind of transfer skills that they have gained. You mentioned in your introduction that it's part luck, but then also building on experience. So there are perhaps more formal ways of networking or building the experiences you mentioned, like Model United Nations. Do you think writing articles or participating academically can also help?
Yeah. And I think especially even what Harsh said about how international arbitration is still such a growing and changing field and dynamic. So I think I've noticed things like publishing articles and that kind of thing tend to be more important as opposed to a lot of the general commercial litigation work that I do. It's hard to, write an innovative article on like motions practice or something like that, as opposed to international arbitration. So I think that's a good thing to take advantage of. Like there are new things that you can actually write about and that you can contribute to. And even if it's not like a full academic law review length article, it can be something short that you can contribute to different journals or practitioners, more practitioner focused journals. So
just a plug for the articles, which I do think is really important, like Ariana mentioned, like arbitration is a really small community. So I think to the extent you have opportunities to kind of start to build, your reputation as someone with a real interest and dedication in the field, even as a student is crucial. So I think there's oftentimes, as students, opportunities to work with professors once you, enter into, the professional life and perhaps you're working in a law firm. Oftentimes, associates or counsel or partners will appreciate someone that comes to them with an idea or the willingness to take on something that's non-billable, but that will still be a really big, important contribution to the community. And I think even beyond some of like the more academic or long form pieces, which a lot of people may not have necessarily the time to contribute to, there's a lot of, different blogs. I think Thomson Reuters has an arbitration blog that oftentimes will take submissions about cases or developments in certain countries. And especially as a student, that's something that you might have time to contribute to. And then there are organizations like Young ICA that similarly have blogs that they ask people to contribute to. Even if you've just attended a conference or a panel, it's an hour out of your day. Oftentimes they ask for a recap. And that's another great way of contributing to the community, meeting people, meeting editors and other officials at organizations like Young ICA, and then being able to say, put something on your LinkedIn page, I think can go a long way in terms of advancing your career.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think lots of students are great at taking opportunities and taking initiative and finding out what they should do and how to advance their career, but not everyone has access to those. So another question we had was about whether you had mentors along the way, specific guidance in law school. Would you do anything differently if you went back to law school? I mean, how do you think you made the most of those resources? That can go to Ariana, and I think then we would also move on back to Katie on the memberships and conferences about innovative networking. But if we start with Ariana.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. Can you remind me what exactly the question is?
Yeah. So it's about specific guidance in law school and whether you had mentors and if you would do anything differently if you went back.
Yeah. So I think it's very important to have a mentor, and not even one mentor, because I think another important piece of advice is like, there's not going to be one person that's going to give you all the things that you need. So I tend to think of mentors as people that they can give you valuable advice, but take everyone's advice with a grain of salt and kind of take what you can and take what works for you and kind of think about the advice that you're given from a mentor and then what has worked for you in the past. Because I think sometimes, especially for people who don't have connections within the community, as I said, don't come from a family of lawyers. I didn't know that much about this field before I went to law school. And so sometimes I think then when you meet people that are very prominent in the field, sometimes you may kind of take their advice too seriously. So I remember one anecdote I have is it was during my 1L summer again, and I had some time to travel. And so I was looking through my law school's directory, and I'm sure Georgetown has something similar where you can find out people from your alumni directory that are working internationally or working in the practices that you want. So I was like just looking, willing to marry international people that are working in international arbitration. So I found one of our alumni, and he worked in Paris big firm. And I reached out to him and he was like, oh, you can come visit me. You're going to be in Paris for a few days. Come to my office and we can talk about international arbitration. And so that ended up happening. And he gave me some good advice, but basically, ultimately, he kind of gave me not a pep talk, but it seemed like he was saying, like, this is going to be really tough for you and this might not work out. And so and at that point, I hadn't really had that many people, I didn't have a mentor yet. And I took his advice. So I was like, oh, wow, well, like, he doesn't think I'm cut out to do this. And, I might not make it. I don't know, like, 4 languages. I'm not a polyglot. I don't go to a T14. I don't have this experience. And so if I took his advice as the end all be all, and I just gave up at that point, then I wouldn't be here. And so I think it's really important to not take someone's advice like that. And he was very well intentioned. I think he just wanted me to be aware of how competitive it can be, which it is in some circumstances, but I have some advice later on that as well. But yeah, just don't take someone's advice as like the one true thing, and kind of talk to a lot of people. And as Harsh said before too, I think sometimes when people are networking, they might always aim to talk to like the partner or someone who's like very, very influential in the field. But I think number one, this field has changed so much that I think it's really important to talk to people kind of closer to the ground that are juniors, because the way that people networked and got ahead in the past is very different than now. And then also just, yeah, so that's what I would say for now.
Definitely. I totally agree with all of that. And I guess just to add as to like the mentoring and the guidance perspective, I think as has been mentioned, networking really is sort of a give and a take. It's a conversation. It's having relationships with people. So oftentimes, you're reaching out to someone whose, career or life, like you might, really admire, and hopefully, you all are exchanging ideas and having conversations. So it's not just about how to advance your own career, but also just kind of, talking with them and learning from them and seeing how you can be helpful to them as well, I think, is the type of mentoring relationship that you want to have with people. And I think particularly in international arbitration, having sort of those relationships can be really helpful and really important, because, networking is in, I guess the most traditional sense, probably a little bit about, self-promotion. But I think the people that are most successful in this field, have people that are promoting you as well, so it's not just you promoting you, it's other people that are really advocating for you and inviting you into different opportunities. And so I think oftentimes when you have someone who you consider to be a mentor or a friend, or, someone who provides you guidance, ideally they're also thinking of you for different opportunities, and promoting you and helping you advance in your career, whether it's, taking on cool cases, to develop the skills that you need, or presenting you with the opportunity to become more involved in the international arbitration community. And I think, beyond sort of having those relationships with perhaps professors or people at the firm that you work with, whether it's associates or, someone more senior, I think, joining international arbitration organizations is another great way to kind of expand that and meet more people, particularly perhaps if you start your career in a place that, may not have sort of the practice that you want, and you might, eventually be thinking about switching. And I think, the young international arbitration groups are a really good start, because there you have more opportunities, I think, for engagement, to become involved, to become part of, program committees or sort of other smaller groups. Because really it's not enough, I think, just to kind of, get on an email listserv and to put your name on something and to have that on your resume, but really you want to be, engaged in that group and working closely with people and, thinking about how you can contribute to that organization. And I think oftentimes from the, more junior practitioner perspective, it's those sort of young arbitration groups where you're best able to do that, because it's sort of more people in similar, in a similar boat. And then, and that provides oftentimes opportunities to meet even more, people or different people that, you can build those relationships with.
Yeah, and speaking of all of these different organizations, we're very grateful to have many of them sponsoring us today. You should see them on the slides, and feel free to get in contact with them. We not only do we have our panelists, we have different events going on, and I'm sure you can speak to them today, but also reach out to them on LinkedIn or by email. The whole point of these events is to get to know people. So you don't just have to listen. Feel free to make the most of the networking afterwards as well. And on the topic of meeting people and building relationships, of course, the pandemic has changed this. We've all experienced it with, Zoom meetings and lectures and all the rest of it. So, Harsh, moving on to you, do you think there are any specific tips for Zoom calls and pandemic-specific networking? How do you think it's best for our students to adapt?
Good question. It's certainly been a challenge to meet people face to face, and that has had a lot of downstream consequences for everyone. What I can tell, what I think is probably the best advice I can give you is to not be shy. It's not that hard to strike up conversations or to get introduced to or meet people virtually or by phone or by email. I'll tell you one thing I do, which might seem a little odd, but I found it enormously productive, and it's helped build. Sometimes I'll just read a book about international arbitration, let's say about, judicial acts, and I'll find it interesting. And I'll write to the author and I'll be like, hey, I read your book. I thought it was great. I worked on this case and this issue came up and I found it really interesting how you dealt with this. Have you thought about this? Have you thought about, and we have very productive conversations that way. And I've been invited to co-author articles by much more senior practitioners who are just excited that I'm excited about something that they're excited about. And so what I would tell you is that probably the hardest part of networking is to take the first step, to reach out to say, hey, I saw your profile. Funny coincidence. I went to William & Mary as well. I'm going to be in Paris. Would you have time for coffee? And sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't, but keep trying. I think, generally speaking, we've all gotten used to Zoom. And in some ways, I think Zoom is a great liberator because you can be anywhere in the world. And you can be, doing whatever and from your dorm room or whatever. You don't have to now sign up for an expensive international arbitration event that costs $100 and travel halfway across or go to New York or Chicago or London or Paris. You can do it from anywhere. So take advantage of that. One of the things I've seen in the last couple of years attending, say, ICC conferences is, there's a lot of dead time. There's a lot of dead air. Even when you're broken into rooms that are specifically designed for networking, very few people are actually interested in engaging with the other people in the room and talking about the panel they just heard, the speakers they just heard. And so being intellectually curious, being intellectually engaged is probably a good way to build relationships.
That's great. Thank you. And in terms of the challenges of taking a first step, and as an LLM student, do you have any advice for students that are practitioners in other fields, breaking into arbitration, wanting to transition? Do you think there's specific advice that would help those students?
You wanted to answer?
Yeah. We can try a different question if you prefer.
Yes, I think so. I think it's actually much easier as a practitioner in another field, or I think it's easier as a practitioner in another field to break into international arbitration because you worked at other law firms, you have a background that will be probably useful if you're an IP litigator. There's an obvious, you can have an obvious interest in IP arbitrations if you're working in international trade. There's cross-fertilization, even if you're a transactional lawyer. There's cross-fertilization. Arbitration is really a process. And so theoretically, it's open to any kind of other substantive field of law to come in and arbitrate, with the possible exception of criminal law. So I would say that one of the important steps if you're a practitioner in another field is sort of exploring the opportunities first within the organization you're in, And then there may be opportunities there, and there may not be. And it doesn't necessarily depend on whether your firm has an international arbitration practice. A friend of mine was working at a very well-known English law firm, but she'd sort of started her career with a training contract, and then she had gone on to join the insurance group, and then that was it. She was an insurance litigator. Mm-hmm. And it was very, very hard for her to convince the international arbitration group to let her transfer over. And she ended up doing an LLM just so she could get into international arbitration. But that's not generally the case. And in that respect, American firms are usually more open, theoretically, than English firms or firms in different parts of the world. The other thing, if you're a practitioner in another field, is just try and expose your interest in international arbitration by looking for that area of overlap, and trying to write something, trying to get involved in that field, speak at conferences, meet practitioners.
Okay, and in addition to that experience, there's of course the qualifications you have, and Harsh, you're qualified in different jurisdictions, Ariane in different jurisdictions too. I mean, Harsh, would you recommend that international students who are interested in working in this area take a particular bar exam, take multiple bar exams? What's your approach to this?
Don't take as many bar exams as I have.
How many is it?
I have taken, I think, 4 bar exams. Definitely fewer. Look, honestly, you could probably practice international arbitration without even being a qualified lawyer. There's no requirement to be a lawyer to practice international arbitration, although, and there are very specialized fields in which you could get away with not being a lawyer in international arbitration. If you're doing an LLM, taking the New York bar is a no-brainer. If you come from a different country, like I'm of Indian origin, so obviously I have the Indian bar exam, and I grew up in the UK, so I qualified as a listener in the UK. But don't take bar exams just for the sake of it. There's a point of diminishing returns, and I think probably I hit that point and kept going. So.
Well, that's good to hear for those of us just finishing the bar exams or studying for them. We don't have to go forever. I suppose maybe moving on to Katie and thinking of those different experiences, how can you put those into effect in interviews? What can students expect when interviewing for positions at firms in big law, for example?
Definitely. I think it probably largely depends on where you're interviewing. But at least I think in my experience, having been on the side of, being the person subjected to many different interviews looking for a job, and also now in the more fortunate position of interviewing people that are looking for jobs. I think in my experience, the interviews are largely personality focused. So I think, honestly, just coming in and being, your personable self, showing enthusiasm for the type of work that the law firm does, and being inquisitive and coming with questions, I think, always is really encouraging from the perspective of someone who's looking, if they would want to work with that person, if they would want to hire that person. I think international arbitration, and, if you're specifically looking for a role in international arbitration at a firm, you might want to come in with a little bit more knowledge about the type of arbitration or the type of work that the firm is doing, and even your interviewer. I find it really helpful, and I can always tell when you're interviewing someone and they've spoken with other people that work at your firm. So beyond sort of just doing your homework and your diligence and, trying to read up in the news as to what, the firm and the practice group is working on, I think it can be really helpful to reach out to people before the interview and try to get a real sense, beyond what you can read on Chambers or Law 360 or GAR or any of those news sites, what the practice group is like. Is it big? Is it small? How are the teams staffed? What type of cases are you working on? In my practice group in New York in particular, we do primarily commercial arbitrations and primarily focused in Latin America. So, someone coming in, with an interest, maybe that's far outside of that realm is going to be, I'm going to have a lot less to speak with them about. And it might indicate to me that they may not actually want a job at Cleary Gottlieb in our particular New York office. And maybe, they'd be better positioned in Paris or London. So I think kind of coming in with that knowledge, but also the enthusiasm, are kind of two, key things that I always look for in interviews, and can really go a long way in terms of distinguishing yourself as a candidate.
That's great. Thank you. And are there any, staying with you, Katie, are there any particular skills that employers are looking for when interviewing? I mean, of course, personality is a good start, but do you find that there's anything particular that our students can look into in preparation?
Yeah, I think having real world skills is always really important. So oftentimes, beyond just having a more interesting conversation, I think it can be really helpful to see that someone has either worked before law school or has worked during law school, and comes in perhaps with a little bit of experience or at least a little bit of knowledge as to what, an international arbitration practitioner does. And even to the extent, if you find yourself in my position as I was in law school, not really having arbitration experience, I think just trying to get practical experience as to what it is to be a lawyer is helpful. So, participating in clinics and being able to kind of demonstrate that you've, gotten writing experience, perhaps you've had some oral advocacy experience, even if it's not, for, an important, Fortune 500 client matter. I think doing it, on the pro bono sense or for a clinic is also a really good experience. And I think, another skill that we look for oftentimes are language skills. It's certainly not a prerequisite, but I think in terms of thinking about how international arbitration is sort of evolving, I think that's always really helpful to show, or maybe it's experience in a different culture, like living in a different place and working in a different place. Even if you don't have those language skills, I think will sort of impart upon your interviewer a sense that you might have a little bit of like cultural fluency or ability to kind of work with international clients a little bit more easily than perhaps someone that doesn't have that experience.
Okay, thank you very much. And I suppose we've got the benefit of having both JD and LLM students here today. So Harsh, would you mind commenting on any differences firms are looking at between JD and LLM candidates? Do you think there's a different approach to interviewing, a different approach to how you present yourself to these firms?
There's a world of difference. And let me start with perhaps where Katie left off, which is that, the suite of skills that is required or expected in international arbitration can seem very demanding. You have to speak 6 languages, win every moot court tournament out there, publish 6 articles, clerk for the International Court of Justice, and run triathlons in your spare time. And I didn't do any of those things. What I think that firms are looking for beyond being personable and a good colleague, the bread and butter of a junior associate is being a good writer. That's what you'll be asked to do, and being a writer and writing something that is writing demonstrates both your analytic chops, which are very important, and your ability to do what you'll be doing more or less day to day. So that is a particular skill that I think you should focus on. The second skill that I think is helpful is oral advocacy, because ultimately to be a litigator is to make a case for your client, and part of learning how to make a case for your client is learning how to make the case for yourself. And there are things you can do that will help you, as Katie said, speaking to people at firms. But even if you don't know anyone at the firm you're interviewing with or the like, just look at people's online profiles. People tell you an awful lot of yourself if you just pay attention and look carefully. And the other thing I would say about LLM students is, of course, that it's much, much harder. Certainly in the United States, but probably globally. There is no soft path to going from being a summer associate to being a junior associate to sort of, which group would you like to work in? There's, so every LLM student has to forge their own path. And that may seem like a very daunting prospect, and it is. And it pissed me off no end when I was an LLM student. But the benefit of going to the School of Hard Knocks is that it toughens you up. And so what I would encourage you to do is to remember that focus on your strengths and sort of focus on how you can make the most of your strengths in the community, in the world, and in the marketplace. And so focus on what you have to offer, and everyone has something to offer. So.
Yeah, and thinking about what you have to offer and kind of reflecting on your strengths, I suppose a nice question to finish up on before we move on to the audience is, Katie, what do you wish you had known when you were a student? Is there anything you would have done differently? Are there any big myths about big law that you would have liked to have been told of? I suppose we have the benefit of hindsight now that our students don't. So is there anything kind of as an ending message you would like to give?
I mean, I think in terms of, doing things differently, from my experience, I would just say, this is an incredible opportunity, whether it's, 3 years of law school or 1 year, in your LLM program or, maybe a mix of whatever programs you might be taking on, take the classes and do the clinics and, take on the RA teaching assistant positions that interest you, because it's an incredible gift of a couple of years in which, perhaps your life is on pause or, just beginning, but you get to be in this classroom and you get to learn. And I feel like, there's a lot of learning that happens once, you join a firm or an organization or an institution and start working, but it's a different type of learning. And I think it's a real, treasure to be sort of being taught. And I'm sure by, some incredibly talented professors. So really just take the classes that interest you. And, to the extent that, I think it serves you in your career later, it will, because it will show, your intellectual curiosity and the skills that you develop there will certainly transfer over to whatever work you do in the future. To the extent you can also get practical skills, whether it's, again, externships, internship opportunities or clinics. I think that's always really helpful in terms of preparing you to be a really successful lawyer. And in terms of things that have surprised me coming in and working in big law now for a few years, just to echo and I guess end with something that Ariana said at the beginning, which is you don't have to check your personality at the door. I think it's a true asset to come in, the same person as you always were. And, to not just think of yourself as part of like the machine, but also someone, who can be an individual and can contribute in a unique way. And I feel like that will also make you better at what you do and also more willing to lift up other people, which I think is something that when you do it, and you don't necessarily always do it with an audience, it will still show and it will make, you a better lawyer. And, your clients will gravitate towards you and other people in your career will gravitate towards you. And I think it's a key to being successful.
Well, that's a great message to end on. Thank you. And now moving on to the audience, is there anyone that has a question? If you'd like to briefly introduce yourself and then pose the question, we'll be happy to take a couple. Yeah, go ahead.
I had one question.
I can start with an answer to that. For me, it's very difficult because it's very, not in the sense of like it can't be done in terms of a career path. And my firm is sort of at a point, our New York office, where we're taking on a lot more investment treaty arbitrations out of New York, which is exciting. But for me, it's a huge learning curve. And I guess maybe that would be a regret. I wish I had taken a class in investment treaty arbitration. So when people use terms like fork in the road, I knew what they were talking about. So that I think is something that, to the extent you try to make that transition, it's certainly feasible, particularly if you work at a place that has, both of those, practice areas. But I do think it requires more work in the sense of, you probably have to, read more articles or, attend a few more conferences where you can kind of learn about, the trends or the different types of law, because it's two different fields entirely. And it can be difficult, I think, to get up to speed.
I think that's right. I think beyond the substantive knowledge that you need to be in investment arbitration, I think there are just fewer opportunities in investment arbitration generally globally. There are many more firms competing for investment arbitration cases. The revenues that are generated from a market perspective from investment arbitration are more limited. And so to the extent you can get the opportunity to do in this, sort of embarrassment of riches. If you can do both, do both. But if you have to choose one of the two fields that will put food on your table and you want to, die at the age of 90 doing international arbitration, choose commercial arbitration, because that won't go away in 5 years. And who knows, investment arbitration might.
All right. Thank you. Is there anyone else with a question? Yeah.
I want to ask if there's a term that Is that lawsuit or trying to force the factor and deal with the weight of the factor that are
I can start. Coming from a Latin America practice group background, I don't think it's not, a sort of a shackle. At least for me, I think sometimes you will probably find yourself, positioned for a career in that area because perhaps you have language skills or you sort of have like the cultural sensitivities in terms of, dealing with clients. But I don't think at all it's something that, you have to maintain forever. I think, demonstrating an interest in other, regions or areas, I think can be helpful. And, I think pretty much every firm or every practice group I can think of, has, a diversity of, individuals in each of their practice groups. It's certainly not like because you have a background, if you're European, you have to practice in, for European based companies. I think there's a lot of flexibility as long as you sort of demonstrate an interest. But just given, sometimes the need for language skills, you might find yourself, being asked to take on certain tasks.
I think it depends on the stage of your career, to be honest. Being, playing to your strengths is a good thing. And if you're Latin American, frankly, there are a lot of cases out of Latin America, so use it. But I have to say, as a philosophical matter, I just fundamentally reject the idea that you can be an international arbitration practitioner and solely focused on one region. International arbitration is really for people who feel uncomfortable in every country in the world, and therefore are always looking to move, always looking to learn about other regions. And that's one of the coolest things about doing this. So, if you're Latin American and you're interested and you have a lot of knowledge about Latin America, that's great. But, at some point in your career, try to do a case out of South Korea or out of Egypt or out of Finland, because that's the fun of doing this.
Yeah. And I think that's the benefit of international arbitration as well. You're sort of detached from any national, sort of court system. So conceivably you should be, trying to take up those opportunities in your career to, have those diversity of experiences, because that's the type of, incredible freedom that international arbitration can afford.
Great. Thank you. Are there any final questions? Yes.
I was wondering, I think it was Harsh mentioning that for LLMs you have to hold their own way to it. And looking from an employer's perspective, how the process works. For example, if you need someone in the arbitration practice, do you go out through your network first, or do you just or even would you even check the resume if you don't have any open positions?
Great question. So let's talk about the formal processes first, and then we can talk about the informal ones. The formal process, at least for LLM students, you have the ISIP program, or I think you still do, in New York, where a lot of firms turn up for job fairs, and some of those firms turn up because they have positions they need to fill. Some of them turn up because they're curious and they might hire the right candidate if they meet someone who's a good fit. So the most reliable indicator of whether there's a job opening is if they post a job opening online or on their website, or and if you're looking to break into international arbitration and someone posts a job opening, apply. Unless there's something that disqualifies you. But it would be incorrect to say that the formal processes are the only or even necessarily the main way of hiring. International arbitration is still, for better or for worse, probably for worse, a pretty cliquey place. And breaking in is not easy. So often when there's an opening, the partner might have in mind someone that he or she knows. That they think would be a good fit for a junior associate position, and you're never going to know that unless you know the partner. So, speaking to practitioners, asking them if they know about any opportunities is also a good way to find out. And most practitioners will take the time to be honest and say, my firm doesn't have any opportunities right now. And some will say, well, try X firm or Y firm. And I think that, kind of keeping your ear to the ground is probably a good way to the extent you can, is a good way to find out about opportunities. But different organizations also have different hiring practices. So, for example, the World Bank, where I started out, they're required to advertise every job that they have. So, those kinds of places it's good to check that website periodically, because if they have a job, they'll tell you.
Yeah, I have something to add that isn't directly related, but I thought of it because I was like, okay, I'm going to say something about this, but I wasn't sure exactly where to fit it in. I think that was all really great advice. And I think on your end, it's really important, I think, for people to be flexible and to not limit themselves to a certain pipeline of how they think they're supposed to get into the field. Because sometimes I hear a lot about, like, you think that you're only going to look at X ranked firm, like this firm is ranked this in international arbitration. And if I did it that way, then I wouldn't have the job I do right now. And so when I was doing my 2L summer associateship at Eversheds, they did have a international arbitration practice on the international side, so on the European side, but in our DC office, there wasn't even an international arbitration practice. And so I had to be really strategic about it, in the sense that I was like, okay, I'm a summer associate, and usually our summer associate program is you're open to all practices, but you can kind of say, like, this is what I'm leaning towards. And so I said, I'm interested in international work. I know that you don't have an international arbitration practice right now, but I want to do litigation. And then over my summer, I found out, and I knew, because I wouldn't go if it wasn't a full possibility, but I knew that they were planning on hiring lateral partners to expand their international arbitration practice. So I think sometimes if you limit to say, I'm only going to go to these firms that are ranked on the top 30 of chambers or some other ranking system, then you're missing out on, it might be more strategic for you to be a big fish in a small pond and join something when it's growing and expanding as a practice, as opposed to trying to fight into something that's already very established and very competitive at a firm that already has, a very, very long-standing international arbitration practice. So I think consider being flexible and trying to find those opportunities where you can jump in and kind of help some partners build a practice, as opposed to something more established. So.
Well, unless there are any other burning questions, I think that would be a good note to end on being flexible, opening to starting conversations. That's why we're here. We're moving into our coffee breaks. So feel free to network with each other. You're valuable resources to yourselves, but also with our panelists. And thank you all for coming to this panel. We look forward to meeting you.